I think there's a little bit of a red flag in the community solar market right now, where you look at the state of policy in a lot of the bigger states that in the Midwest, Washington, Oregon, et cetera, and they're not in a position from a legislative perspective where there would be any meaningful community solar over the course of the next 4 or 5 years. There's still policy that would have to be passed, programs that would have to be implemented.
Hello and welcome to the Solar Maverick Podcast, where solar meets entrepreneurship and experience. I'm your host, Benoy Thanjan, so let's get into it. Hi, this is Benoy, your host of the Solar Maverick Podcast. I'm really excited to have Garrett Peterson. He's the co-founder of Sigma Renewables. And Garrett, you are a solar maverick. It's amazing to think that you've been in the industry since 2009. And I'm sure you can't believe that you've done 15 years in the solar space or the solar coaster. And what I like too is that you came from more of a construction background initially as a residential solar installer, and then you worked your way to being a senior vice president of project development at a very large solar developer, and then to now starting your own company. It would be great if you could talk about Sigma Renewables and your background before you started your own company. And I appreciate you making time on the podcast because I think you'll have a lot of valuable insights from your experience.
Thanks for having me, Benoy. It's been a bit of a ride looking back at 15 years, and everybody says the solar coaster, but it truly is a lot of ups and downs. I started in solar on a residential install crew, and that was my background. I had gone to school for environmental science and biology and had gotten laid off from a contracted oil and gas biology position and done construction as a kid growing up in high school and college. And the renewable aspect with my undergrad in environmental science, biology kind of fit with my construction background and took off from there. But yeah, it was truly kind of a start at the bottom, just running up roofs and installing panels on homes. And then progressively just grew from a standpoint of project management on residential systems, then project management on commercial systems, then started to get a taste for development when we would be requested to do, say, special use permitting or something like that on a big commercial system. And then more and more got kind of pulled into that over the course of my career as I really started to focus on development about 10 years ago. And, spent some time at REC Solar, then it got turned into Sunrun, Namaste Solar, Sun Edison, SunShare, ultimately Pivot, and then moved on from there to start Sigma Renewables.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's amazing to think about. You've worked at a lot of, major solar companies. What do you think you've learned from that experience, and how has that helped you with starting your own company? Obviously, you mentioned you have 10 years worth of experience, but I'm sure like each stop along the way, you probably have learned something unique that's helped you. And why did you want to become an entrepreneur and start your own company?
Well, I think every time you're at a company, you can't help but kind of notice how you would do things differently and how you would want to change things. And, for better or worse, sometimes that doesn't happen at that company. And so I think part of the drive is always thinking that you've got a way to do it a little bit better, maybe a little bit more efficiently. And, probably like a lot of people in the solar industry or any other industry for that matter, my moves between companies were primarily because I hit a wall or I hit a ceiling where there wasn't a whole lot left to do at that company from maybe an opportunity or growth standpoint. And so if you're just trying to keep scaling in your career, you're going to look for those opportunities. And eventually you're going to say, I'm pretty comfortable here and I like the steady paycheck. Or you say, I'm going to go out and, test the waters and see how scary it can really be. So that was my progression.
Yeah. I mean, I could relate with that. I mean, obviously I have my own company and I think, like you always think you could do things better or there's more efficient ways to do it. And obviously having your own business, it gives you that freedom. And I think if anyone ever wants to start their own business, they should try it because I think it's better to try and fail than never try at all. So
absolutely. I mean, it's a scary experience. It's a humbling experience, but it's also the highs are really high and the lows are really low. It is truly that, on a day-to-day, sometimes an hour-to-hour basis. But it's one of those things where exactly what you said. I'd rather try it and not have it work out than never have a real go at it.
Yeah, and that's actually a great thing that you mentioned about the highs are really high and the lows are really lows. And I think that's like a major attribute of an entrepreneur is to be able to mentally handle that. And obviously, as you have more experience being an entrepreneur, it gets easier. But still, like I know it's been what, like around 16 to 17 months since you started. So it's a relatively new venture. And also, as you know, development takes a lot of time. There's also been challenges with development with obviously the Inflation Reduction Act and getting more guidance on that and recently the tariffs on panels, states, with different legislation. Can you talk about like I guess what you've been working on? What type of projects are you focused on? What states are you seeing? And I think that would be really helpful to understand for our audience.
Yeah, the focus for us as an efficient team is really trying to hone in on what we're good at, and that is DG development. So, community solar, net metering, energy storage on the distribution level. And our primary focus is we want to bring value to our landowner partners, our institutional property owner partners. And the more opportunities there are within a certain market to do that, say New York, where you could have energy storage, you could have rooftop solar, the more opportunity there is for us to really participate in that market. And so we want to be efficient with our time. And if you think about kind of the Venn diagram where all those opportunities overlap, it really kind of pins us into the mid-Atlantic, New York, Maryland, New Jersey, and those areas where there's favorable policy towards all that, or at least expanding policy. The challenge of development obviously is there's a time perspective. There's also a capital perspective. There's frankly, a risk perspective that you don't control. And a place like California, candidly, we spent a fair amount of time there working on a portfolio, and we're still waiting on complete ruling of what that program turns out to be, but it doesn't look like the most fruitful endeavor for us and a lot of other companies, not just Sigma. But that's kind of the risk you take with policy and trying to be an early mover. So right now we're figuring out what the next steps are in a place like California while, navigating energy storage moratoriums in places like New York, understanding when the DOE maps update and something that was an energy community now is no longer an energy community. How does that impact our financial model? What does that do? Does it change anything? It's a day-to-day just problem solving and trying to make the best use of your time.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we actually as well spent a lot of time looking at California. It's disappointing, obviously, that it looks like California PUC is not going to be moving forward with the proposed community solar legislation. It's interesting because you mentioned about getting early into markets, because obviously, once you have an established market, markets get pretty saturated pretty quickly, obviously, like New York. So, like, you have to kind of be a first mover, and there's a risk to that, right? So I do feel like there'll be some sort of solution outside of a community solar program in California. I know they're talking about a PURPA program through the utilities, but we'll see. And maybe it's other sort of solution. But can you talk about like the challenges of that? I mean, especially when you're a new company, you want to create a track record, especially now. It's not an easy time right now in renewables and solar with high interest rates. I mentioned the Inflation Reduction Act. There's not a lot of community solar sort of programs, offtake for batteries, meaning like it's easy to get like a long-term contract to get a bank comfortable. How do you hone in? I mean, you kind of talked about that you're kind of working through that. And
I think the entire solar industry really is hopeful and working in a concerted effort to make something salvageable come out of California. It's definitely a conflict when you see a very broad kind of edict by the California government, EV electrification, things like that. But then simple policies like residential and commercial solar net metering and something like community solar are kind of killed at the PUC level. I'm hopeful that something comes out of that, but you have to take some risk as a developer. I feel like you make your money before there's a policy in place in terms of land positions and things like that, but it's a sliding scale. And if you look at a place like Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, some of these other states that have introduced community solar legislation and have seen a lot of interest from bigger national developers that have the capital to go take a lot of land positions and just sit on them. But when you look at something like that, if you're in the legislation introductory phase in 2024, as a developer, I might not see monetization of that for another 3+ years. and you don't know what that program is going to look like. You don't know, is it going to be something like New Mexico where there was 200 megawatts and 10x over applied for? That's a risk we need to try to avoid as a very early developer in terms of our capital availability and positions. Something like California, we deemed as a reasonable risk because legislation had passed. There were existing community solar programs in place. So it seemed like a realistic kind of stepping stone to make something more functional. But, you compare that risk versus a place like New York, where I would venture to guess that every viable landowner and land site in New York has been contacted, and you're fighting for the scraps of what's left in terms of a program. And New York's been very successful, but there's probably not a whole lot more capacity coming out of New York. So you're kind of risk weight that of like, what's the upside of being early in something where there may be policy versus just kind of fighting tooth and nail for a little bit of capacity in an existing market. And both have obviously worked for companies, but it's something that we have to be aware of how efficiently we spend our time and our money in those different markets. So for me, I look at it as, I think there's a little bit of a red flag in the community solar market right now, where you look at the state of policy in a lot of the bigger states that in the Midwest, Washington, Oregon, et cetera, and they're not in a position from a legislative perspective where there would be any meaningful community solar over the course of the next 4 or 5 years. There's still policy that would have to be passed, programs that would have to be implemented, tariffs put in place by the utility to allow for interconnection. And so unless you as a company have balance sheet or the backing for a 5+ year runway, those markets just aren't going to come to fruition for you. And I think the other very large companies out there that have been a little bit of a one-trick pony in terms of the community solar space are going to have a tough time over the course of the next couple of years, really filling that capacity that I think has been promised to the market. So while California wasn't great for us, we feel like we're in a good position from just a flexibility perspective and being able to focus on a handful of good projects.
This episode of the Solar Maverick Podcast is brought to you by Podcast Laundry, the podcast concierge service that I use to make sure that my listeners hear the best quality show. They do the dirty work of podcasting for me. Yes, graphics, quotes, show notes, master editing, and much more. All I have to do is record. So if you're a busy podcaster like me with an engaged audience and want to free up time to do more of what you love to do, like going to the gym or spending time with loved ones, go to podcastlaundry.com to schedule your consultation or call 347-871-8273. That's podcastlaundry.com or 347-871-8273. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, that's what it's all about. And honestly, these are great insights, Garrett, that I feel like not a lot of industries talking about. So I appreciate you talking about that. And obviously the large companies have large goals. And I think you're right. Everything's going to take a lot longer than people are expecting. We haven't even talked about like interconnection issues or upgrading, permitting, supply chain as well. Obviously there were tariffs were increased for Chinese panels and some South Asian manufacturers. So we don't right now really produce that many panels to basically take advantage of that. And that will obviously slow development, increase costs. And you're right. I believe, as what you're saying, like the smaller, nimbler players are the ones that are going to be able to flourish in this type of environment. I believe it's not as easy as it was before,
I would wholeheartedly agree with you from that perspective, of interconnection challenges. You look at a place like Illinois, and nearly every single substation is probably double capacity in terms of backlog interconnections. That's a challenge. And obviously the state's working to continue implementing renewable energy and community solar, but it's at a set rate. And so there'll be a lot of developers sitting there for a long time. I think on the permitting side, it's a challenge from just a local perspective. I think obviously for worse, but solar has become very, very much a political kind of identifier. And if you support solar, you seem to be Democrat and blue. And if you don't, you seem to be Republican and red. And it takes a pretty strong local board to kind of cut through all that and see a project for its merits and its benefits to the community. And unfortunately, a lot of good projects are probably missing out on permits in places that same support. And it is really challenging from that perspective. And like you said, that the panel tariffs, they create uncertainty if you're competitively bidding an RFP or something like that. And it really, points to how much of the process can you control. If you're, a bigger company, obviously you have an advantage over maybe you've got safe harbored modules and you've procured things out in advance and you've got more just financial stability to ride that out. So that's in part to the challenge of just how far do companies lean in on projects and procurement and things like that, and what's the outcome there.
Yeah, those are great insights. And I think you're right. Like, it's unfortunate that solar has been like a political sort of hot button. And, in most cases, it's pretty much the cheapest form of energy. And, there's unfortunately other aspects outside of that that's making it more difficult to develop. And I think it's also too, like you mentioned, you're focused on PJM, that's obviously another great market. And obviously they're working through to try to streamline the interconnection process, and obviously that all takes time.
Yeah, especially on a transmission level. But I don't know if the industry as a whole, I'm sure a lot of people understand it, but even in a deregulated market like PJM, you don't have a pathway forward for a distributed generation solar site because you can't file for just a wholesale merchant participation agreement. Even if you found like a good project and you had a willing buyer for the power or for the RECs, you can't even file that right now. So it is really kind of limited development in PJM to purely, community solar based type of programs. And as a whole, I think one thing policy wise that SEIA, I know, is working towards is interconnection reform, but that's a challenge in a deregulated market. Look at a regulated market like Colorado, where the city of Denver has instituted some pretty aggressive renewable energy procurement standards and things like that. And there's not even a pathway forward for big commercial customers to go out and procure that energy. They can't do it from a third-party developer, and Excel limits it to their power. And so that inhibits the growth of the industry. So, as a whole, I think our policy reform needs to lean a little bit more on kind of deregulation of some of these bigger utility spaces. That would provide more opportunity than, adding 50 megawatts to an existing community solar program.
Oh, for sure. That's a great point. And I wonder whether sometimes it gets lost in the messaging within the lobbying groups because, there tends to be the lot bigger companies, have more control because they're, sponsoring obviously, or their commitment to the lobbying groups financially. That's been an issue in the past.
It's a challenge. If anything, recent California kind of decision it showcased how powerful the investor-owned utilities in the state are. And that's not isolated to just California. That's in a lot of the US. So it's a formidable challenge for sure.
It definitely is. And it'll be interesting to see over time how I think, as you mentioned, California is obviously a good market and has been a good market, and how it'll adjust based on, what the IOUs or the California PUC decide to do going forward. Can you talk about, I know you're doing a lot in battery storage. Can you talk about like the BESS market? I'm not familiar with BESS. It is battery energy storage systems, BESS.
So the BESS market I view it as being somewhere where solar was 5 to 10 years ago. The majority of the energy storage deployments, I think, have been either on the utility level, where you've got gigawatt hours of energy storage associated with utility scale solar, or in some cases just standalone. Obviously, the IRA helped with that a lot, making it ITC eligible. And then you look at it maybe on the residential level, like the Tesla Powerwall, and there's a bit of breakthrough on kind of behind the meter, like peak load shavings and things like that in different states. On the DG level, I feel like energy storage is where solar was 5 to 10 years ago. And it'll take some policy pushing that forward. New York's obviously been a pretty big advocate of that, and there's definitely been growth there. We're focused on some aspects of New York, obviously downstate. And then there are some other utilities that are doing storage procurement, and you've got the load growth in PJM from data centers and things like that, where that market is going to just continue to be kind of driven by, frankly, just almost an emergency need for energy storage, grid regulation, and frequency regulation, and really just combating, maybe not combating is the right word, offsetting the influx of renewables during the day and excess energy. But on the distributed level, it's still largely concentrated on a state like New York, where there's incentives in place. New Jersey has established a storage target. Maryland's established a storage target, but they haven't done much more than that. Maybe there's some working groups, but to me, that's again an example of like until legislation passes and until some sort of program is in place, that's still 3 to 4 years off from any sort of real actual development and turning systems on. One other challenge that we're seeing with the storage market is, moratoriums have been put up in places where there's a bit of a concern with fires. I think the fires batteries get overly publicized. So there's a lot of education that needs to be done by the industry to local jurisdictions, similar to what happened with solar, where understanding that these are safer than other forms of energy and educating local jurisdictions on benefits. And it's an uphill battle, but that's part of what development is.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, these are all great points. I mean, what you mentioned about states obviously having battery goals, but then, they haven't implemented policy. It seems like there's always a lag between like a target and then the actual policy being implemented. And it takes a lot of time because obviously I have to have different stakeholder groups as well involved. I think you're right. Like, obviously, the lithium ion technology, there's been issues with obviously fire safety and fire code that's made it more challenging to develop projects. And I think it'll be interesting to see because you mentioned how the BESS market's similar to the solar market 5 to 10 years ago. I think you're going to also see obviously the decrease in batteries substantially over the next 3 to 5 years. And then too, as well with the IRA, the ITC obviously now taking into account batteries, which is great for developers of projects.
I'm sure everybody feels, the trending line in terms of overall cost is coming down, which generally speaking is true. I think one of the other hurdles to just energy storage as a whole is getting around the financial modeling of it and then the financing of it from a standpoint of if somebody's going to own a 20-year asset, how much of that revenue stream has to be contracted, how much of it has to be or it could be merchant revenue, uncontracted, just day ahead pricing, and getting groups comfortable with that structure. Again, to go back to where solar was, I remember my first community solar projects, the contract for a subscriber was as thick as a phone book, and they had to have a 800 credit score, and the contract was 30 years long. And now, less than maybe 10 years later, you can do year-to-year subscriptions. There's no credit score check, things like that. So I think one of the things are those financiers who are going to be pushing this forward and say, okay, we're comfortable underwriting that risk, and what can be done to kind of progress that aspect of it, because even certain portions of VDER on the battery side are, if you want to call them merchant risk, it's a fluctuating revenue stream. And so groups are getting comfortable with that. So what do we do as an industry to help push that forward?
Yeah, that's such a great point. I mean, I appreciate you mentioning that because it's amazing to see like how community solar changed, and obviously companies are going to have to be, meaning financiers really, right? Have to be more comfortable with merchant risks. You mentioned VDER, and obviously like there's an LMP component at capacity, and these things are variable. And yeah, I mean, right now it seems challenging, but I'm sure there's going to be innovative financing that is going to get comfortable with it and then be able to move forward with projects.
There are groups doing it in Texas, in the ERCOT market. And part of the reason that they're able to do that is that market is so volatile that you can make back your costs in 10 days. You have to hit those 10 days or those 15 days, and you've got to time it just right. And as more and more batteries come online in a place like ERCOT or California or New York, do those peak windows now come down in terms of cost because there are more resources available, just simple supply and demand. And does that change the economic model, and how quickly does that happen? So I think things like New York with VDER, pushing that forward. I think there are utilities that are doing competitive procurements for storage, and that'll really start to advance it. And it's all kind of just the ride that we're on here.
Yeah, definitely. And then obviously like Massachusetts, the SMART program had a solar plus storage component, which you basically could lock in prices. I mean, I didn't develop any of those sorts of projects, solar only, but I heard that, a lot of projects got built.
A lot of projects got built, but in part it was due to the nature of the SMART program contract and your revenue stream for that time. You locked in that award and you had that contracted revenue. So I think that accelerated a lot of the growth, whereas just a purely energy arbitrage driven play to try to time different windows in the market, there's not a lot of financiers who are really wanting to underwrite that right now.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense. Why, they would obviously prefer some sort of state program where they're locking in certain pricing or, as you mentioned, an RFP process as well to incentivize versus, as you mentioned, like hedging volatility basically and making money and then contracting. So that's pretty interesting. I didn't realize that for Texas. So I appreciate you explaining. I guess what I was going to ask too is obviously you've been in the industry for a very long time. What trends are you seeing in the market, Garrett?
Well, I think the positive trends are there's still continued demand for renewables. And a lot of that is coming from corporates. And I think it's a realization that there's twofold. One is, like you mentioned earlier, it's one of the cheapest forms of power out there. Two, that we are truly making a positive impact here and reducing emissions and shifting the way that we as a country or companies, consume energy. And I think that's the big thing that we all have to remember is that we are not just in the solar industry or the renewable industry, we're in the energy industry. And this is a part of a broader mix that we have to factor our place into there. It's not just the renewable space. There's positive from continued rec procurement and states instituting, pilot programs and things like that. I also think the trend towards community solar being focused on low to moderate income, people that are really truly choosing between the energy bill and like the grocery bill, that's a great positive step forward for the industry. But there's also headwinds, obviously legislative policy, net metering, things like that on a macro level has really been pushed back on by state legislation and PUCs and things like that. So it's a continued challenge that we just keep working with. And I think it's one of those things where you look at companies that have done well. And I think those companies have really been able to kind of steer the direction of one or two markets, and keep an ongoing, whether it's community solar program or net metering program or residential program. There's companies that are really embedded, and that's been a 10-year kind of growth trajectory. I think that trend will continue. The companies that figure out how to make behind the meter PPAs and energy storage and community solar and anything else work in those markets that they know in and out. That's a trend maybe that's slightly ignored because there's so many big companies, but the ones that are really entrenched in certain markets and know them well, I think are going to continue to do well.
For sure, that kind of reminds me of like basically local companies, right? Who are helping, with the legislators coming up with the legislation, then they're understanding it better than anyone. Also, they might have lower customer acquisition costs related to a national company. I mean, that's a great point. There's definitely that opportunity. You see like local companies that just have been very, doing well in certain states and not. I think it's really challenging, as like to be a national company, and people prefer to do business with local companies in that area. I just remember in the beginning of New York's community solar, I'm not going to name the company, but there was a company from California sending, I know who it is, yeah, lease letter of intents or for lease agreements from California. So that creates confusion and people would prefer to do, business with a local company. And
Yeah.
they're initially very aggressive in a very new program. There are a lot of sites from it as well. So,
and I think there's always that place for those national companies. It's just how do they enter those local markets it's called the defining characteristic.
For sure. The Solar Maverick podcast, as you know, is about solar entrepreneurship. You're a solar maverick yourself. Like, what advice would you give to someone who wants to start their own company?
There's a lot of things. As you mentioned, I think if you want to go out there and start your own company, like more power to you, do it. We live in a place where you can. So I think you should, from my standpoint, from lessons learned, so to speak, figure out like the one or two things that you can do better than 90% of the industry. Maybe that's acquiring customers. Maybe that is acquiring land. Figure out what that is and then stick to that, because the industry has grown so much that there's so many different opportunities, which is a great thing. But it's also, you can get so easily distracted of like, I just started a business and I need to do everything. And it really should be like, no, what are those two things that you do better than anybody else or most everybody, and you can go out and just kind of, for lack of a better term, just execute, deliver on that to get started. I think the other thing is, figure out what your business is from a standpoint of development wise. You're aware, you're talking 3-year project cycles easily. Can you go 3 years without getting paid? Maybe, most likely not. So figure out, how much time do you think you can run on your own capital? Because when you put up interconnect deposits, when you start making big land payments, when you start doing any of that stuff, that your own equity goes away very quickly unless you're independently wealthy or something like that. And you've got to have some sort of capital, but it takes a ton of time to raise that capital. It's a process in and of itself. And that is the total, not distraction from running your business, but you're doing two very different things at the same time. And so understanding like, what are your capital needs? How long can you go is really important. And there are a lot of groups out there that'll offer to give capital. You just have to make sure that you're finding the right partner for what your business is going to be.
Oh, that's all great advice. And yeah, it's finding the right partner. It's always going to take longer to develop that project than you think.
Always. And I think that's where you go from, unless you're a serial entrepreneur, if you're going from working at a bigger company where you have a steady paycheck and you get that annual bonus and you get those things, I think there's a certain level of comfort that comes with that, which is obviously why people stay at those companies. But I think there's also a level of complacency that you don't realize when that interconnection comes back as failed, or comes back as $27 million for a DG interconnect. The next week at your bigger company, you're still going to get your paycheck. If you're out there cutting your teeth and trying to do development, your permit meeting gets pushed. Let's say even you have a site get rejected. That can be the difference of like, well, I guess I'm not getting a paycheck for another 3 months or something like that. And so that's something you really have to take into account if you are going to make the jump from, say, a bigger company to go do your own thing. Is like, what's your comfort level for, maybe the dollars not coming in?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's like obviously really important for people to consider and whether they could obviously go that amount of time without receiving a paycheck. And it's scary too once you're used to getting a biweekly paycheck and a bonus. But I think what's great is there's so many jobs in the solar industry that even if it doesn't work out, at least you tried and you could always get a job. Like worst case scenario, I feel like most people could recover from that.
Worst case scenario, you hope that you can find something else, but like all things, even that takes time. I think also when you get into the point where you're working for yourself or you're working for a really tight team of people who have the same goal as you, it feels different probably going back to somebody. And so I think it's kind of one of those things where you got to have the mindset of like, come hell or high water, I am going to make this happen.
Yeah, that was actually the point that I was going to make because if you have like that security blanket, you're always going to think, oh, well, I could always get a job. But if you saying like, I have to make this work, it really does change the narrative.
Yeah. And there's thankfully, I'm not counting myself in this group by any means, but there's a lot of founders out there who have been successful that have given advice and have seen the industry. I've had some good feedback from some founders of other companies who have kind of given direction where it's like a very salient point of learning. They learn from their mistakes. They're trying to pass that along to other people. And thankfully, just the renewable industry as a whole, there's a pretty good collective network of people who've started companies and have experience and want to see others be successful as well.
Yeah, that's definitely true. Like, it's been amazing the mentorship and help from other successful leaders in the clean tech space that have helped me. And obviously, I've been, paying it forward to other companies as well. So that's great to hear that people have been helpful to you in your journey in the entrepreneurship. Yeah, Gareth, this has been an amazing interview. I really appreciate you making time out of your schedule. If our audience would like to learn more about you, what's the best way that they could do that?
The best way is to just connect with me on LinkedIn, Garrett Peterson, or go to sigmarenewables.com, get in touch with us and drop us a line. We're shameless plug here. We're always looking for land and quality solar sites. So reach out to us.
That sounds great. There's obviously people who own land who listen to the podcast, so they know who to contact. And thank you, Garrett, for your time. I appreciate everything you've done for the industry, and I look forward to hearing how things go with Sigma. And it's exciting times in the solar industry, for sure.
Thanks for having me on the podcast, Benoy. I appreciate everything you're doing with the podcast and just bringing this industry forward. Really do appreciate it.
Oh, thank you. I mean, it's a passion of mine. And I think, we need more people like you. And I appreciate you sharing your story and advice because it really does have a positive impact. And we need more voices in the industry. So I appreciate you making the time today.
Likewise.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Solar Maverick Podcast. The Solar Maverick Podcast is brought to you by Reneu Energy. We're a solar development and consulting firm. If you believe that this podcast is adding value to you, please give us a 5-star review and share with those that you think could benefit from this information. Please email all questions, suggestions, and feedback to info@reneuenergy.com. That's info@reneuenergy.com. The Solar Maverick Podcast is produced by Podcast Laundry and executive produced by Benoy Thanjan and Kevin Y. Brown.